Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for staying with us. My name is Chantaline Carpentier, as the speaker said. I'm the chief of the UNCTAD New York office, the UN Conference on Trade and Development here in New York, and we are delighted to have with us our Director of Division of Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD in Geneva, in our headquarters, Shamika Seriman, who will give you a short brief on our new report on the Digital Economy Report 2019, and hopefully you can have a discussion with her. So, Shamika, over to you.
Thank you, Chantaline. Thank you very much for being here. So as Chantaline said, we are launching our Digital Economy Report, and it's looking at how developing countries can create and capture value in this emerging digital world. So let me give you the main points. The first point that we want to put to you is that the geography of the digital economy does not follow traditional north-south lines. Now, when we normally talk about development, we always talk about developed countries and developing countries, and that divide does not apply to the digital economy. In terms of wealth creation, it is basically a tale of two countries, United States of America and China. Together, these two countries account for 90% of the market value of the world's largest digital platform companies. Now, in contrast to that 90%, I would like to present to you Europe's share in the platforms. These mega platforms are only 3.6%. And Africa owns 1.3% of platforms. So this divide between developed countries, developing countries does not exist. And China and the United States have 75% of all patents related to blockchain technologies, and more than 75% of cloud computing market. And these two countries also present half the global spending on Internet of Things. So that's the emerging new world. Second point I would want to put to you is that digital economy is basically is equal to data-driven economy. And it is about the collection. Value is created when the data is collected, stored, analyzed, and transformed into intelligence, and then sold. So who can do that basically stand to gain. And the digital economy, this data-driven economy is moving very fast. Just to give you a couple of numbers, the global internet protocol traffic, it's a good proxy to measure the data flows. It grew from about 100 gigabytes per day in 1992 to more than 45,000 gigabytes per second in 2017. So it's 1992 is only 100 gigabytes per day, and in 2017 it's 45,000 gigabytes per second. So that's how fast this economy has moved forward. And in our report, we also project that the data flows will be about 150,000 gigabytes per second by 2022, as more people are connected to internet and also more things, appliances and other things are connected to internet. So this transformation is happening very, very fast. And the third point, with data, the business model is platforms. Those platforms that can use this data, create intelligence, and sell this data, and they are about to gain in a big way. Just to give you a couple of numbers, the combined value of the platform companies, the big ones, grew by 67% between 2015 and 2017. 67% growth in the platform economies. And this is also happening, this is also creating massive disruptions to the traditional industry. So let me give you an example from newspapers. you see the amount spent on advertising in newspapers in the United States used to be about 66 billion in 2000. And it dropped to 24 billion in 2014. And in our report, there's a forecast is to drop this advertising in newspapers to 40 billion by 2023. So the advertising goes from 66 billion in 2000 to 4 billion in 2023. Because why? Because they're all going digital. It's advertising is happening digital. So that's how we see the traditional, sectors are being affected, and these are very disruptive technologies. So UNCTAD, as you know, some of you know, is the only the UN agency that's created by the developing countries in 1964 to address the needs of developing countries. So the preoccupation of us is that we are quite concerned that the most developing countries will end up as providers of raw data for free, while having to pay for the digital intelligence produced with those same data. So rather than creating and capturing value in the digital economy, that our concern is that most developing countries will end up as giving their data free and buying the intelligence created by the same data. And that's a concern. So in this report, we also take a great pains to go through the policy, what needs to be done, what should the developing countries do to create value and capture value rather than just be consumers of the digital economy. So that was the question that we tried to answer. And we are very clearly present that the technology is not deterministic. It's just a power. How do we harness this power? It's in our hands or in the hands of governments. So we have identified walking into this newly emerging digital economy, the governments cannot do their business as usual. The policy making, decision making needs to be done across governments with multi-stakeholder participation, especially private sector, the financial, the banks, and the education sector has to have a whole of government approach. And in this report, we say it's extremely important to ensure access to affordable and reliable ICT connectivity, because at the moment, half the world is off the internet. And if you go to the least developed countries, only 1 in 5 has access to internet. So if you don't have access to internet, basically you're out of this digital revolution. So our report calls governments to provide affordable and reliable ICT connectivity, and in fact to consider ICT as a critical infrastructure. It's no longer an optional infrastructure. And we also find that when you talk about the digital entrepreneurship, it's natural. It's normally the young people are there and innovating, and the opportunities are huge for the small, medium enterprises, because they can have a presence on the internet, even though they might not have a big presence physically. And it's an amazing media for women to do economic activity, because the internet does not discriminate because you're a woman. But governments need to work hard to build an ecosystem to nurture those entrepreneurs, the young people, the women, and so forth, to finance to provide mentoring, basically to provide business skills, the vocational skills, and so forth. And then we look at data policies, how the data policies have to be different in this new emerging world, how to change the competition policies, because when you look at the antitrust policies now, they're looking at whether the big firms or the multinational companies are charging consumers extremely high and unfair price. But in the digital world, it's not just the price, it's about data. Do these companies have unfair access to data? And what about the data privacy? What about the data protection, the market structures? these need to be introduced to the competition policy. So we have to look into the competition policies in a different way. It's the same for digital taxation. The tax policies that we have is for a tangible world. When you talk about digital taxation, if the company is not domiciled, there's no physical presence to the company in my country, and if it is producing something intangible, it's very difficult to figure out how to tax. So now let me give you an example. We looked at Google and Facebook, and we find 60% of their profits are created outside the United States. But 90% of taxes are paid in the US. So in this report, we call for more work on effective taxation. And also we look at the policies to protect workers online. On a platform, if you're doing gig work, there is no labor union behind you, there's no minimum wages, there's no protection, there's no health insurance, there's nothing. So how do we protect workers who are engaged in gig works? So we call for global actions, especially in few areas, in data policies, competition policies, tax, and how to protect workers. Because these are not issues for one country. These are issues where the collective discussions need to be taken place, and collective decisions should be made on how to do the digital taxation. What is the competition policy in the digital era? How do we make sure that the platforms are not exploiting labor? So in fact, these call for global actions are very much in line with the Secretary General's report on digital cooperation that came a couple of months ago. And in fact, the report was written as a response to the call of the Secretary General of the global cooperation in digital era. And then last but not the least, we also talk about the aid going to developing countries. We find that we look at the aid for trade, because this is more digital economy, it's about trade, e-commerce, and so forth. We find that the ICT sector received about 3% of aid for trade in 2000, and it's dropped to 1% now in 2015. So even though everybody understands this digital, the impact of the digital economy, the ability for it to be destructive, create enormous amount of inequality is all there. But when it comes to the official development assistance, and we don't see the same emphasis, it's gone down basically by half when you compare to 2000, 3% going to ICT in the aid for trade, and now only 1.2% going to ICT now. So these are the points that's being raised in the report. And the main point of the report is how do we make sure that the opportunities created by the digital economy is shared fairly. It's not for a digital economy, it's not for a few, but how do we make it for many? So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shamika. At this point, if you have any questions for Shamika, we'll entertain those. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Evelyn Leopold, and thank you on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. I have a very simple question in trying to cope with all your sophisticated speculations here. Can you give an example of a country or a sub-region? I know one size never fits all in digital economy. That would benefit from what? The internet, the online shopping, Facebook. What would you say? What example can you give in either a developing country or a developing sub-region?
Shamika, you want to?
Yeah. So the areas where they would benefit, some countries. many areas. I think we just heard about the disasters in Bahamas, and you just heard about the cyber bullying and cyber security, and all these areas there can be benefits for developing countries. Because as I said, because the digital is about the data. So once you have enormous amount of data, once you analyze the data and create intelligence, you can provide early warning. You can provide early warning to disasters or early warning to a disease outbreak, Ebola or typhoid. In many places we have seen how the data is analyzed, showcase how the disease spreads. And in education, you can use big data, you can use the AI to provide very customized educational tools for children, because they have different ways of learning. And so that's the health side, the education side, the disaster side. But you can also use these platforms to simply sell products, to connect the producers directly to consumers and cut the middlemen out. If I'm in Ethiopia, if I'm a coffee producer, there's a potential that the internet provides for me is to connect directly to my consumers, like yourselves. You order online, I deliver these products to you, and I capture all the value as a farmer. Because normally the lot of value is captured in the marketing, packaging and all that. But this is the potential. But to realize this potential, you simply need the connectivity.
But in the Bahamas, how would you deliver the early warning? I would think that they have pretty sophisticated communications by now.
I have not really followed the Bahamas very closely because, I think the early warning, I've been seeing this hurricane be monitored throughout. So this monitoring is from satellite data. It's about data analysis. And we saw it's being monitored, on an annual, like an hourly basis, and it was downgrading to a category 4, upgrading to category 5. So this is happening because of big data analytics, especially, using the satellite data, analyzing this data. So the huge value.
Perhaps, Shamika, you gave also, we have a frontier technology report that Shamika's team issued last year, which has a lot of example of how small, especially small, medium enterprises in developing countries can take advantage of the digital innovation to actually deliver on access to affordable access to water, energy, sanitation, education, health that are required for the SDGs. And there's several examples. I don't know if you want to go into this, but we're more than happy to share that document with you as well. To the Commission on Science, Technology for Development.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Arun Lewis from Indo-Asian News Service. I have a series of questions, so let me start with this saying, do you see a split between a Chinese system and a US Western kind of internet system? Like originally it was the worldwide web, but now it appears that we're going to go into two or more systems, and as other countries may also opt for closed-in systems.
I think this is something that we studied. We wanted to, because this is about how to control the ownership of data. And there are different ways of doing it. And we looked at the personal data markets. Basically you put a big wall, and then you have, it's very limited. Data is my data, that's it. Data trust, collective data ownership, digital data commons, meaning the data can be used by everyone. It is given to everyone. So there's a whole spectrum. So in this spectrum lies the US and China. But we also see that, these platforms are not all bad. Like, for example, for this report, we use the Google search engine. So these are not bad technologies. For Facebook, I have connected to friends that I had not seen for 30, 40 years. So it's all very good to have an open internet, but you need to also regulate. You need to make sure that the data, there's some privacy and there's some data protection, and the taxes are paid where you create profits. So that regulations need to be in place. And that's our analysis. We like to keep the open internet, but regulated so that it does not do the unintended things like cyber crimes and the cyberbullying that we just mentioned by the spokesperson. So the regulation is not a bad word. It's a good thing in this emerging digital world.
So I think in both cases, the data is captured by a few companies that then own all of the value creation from that, and it's our data, right?
Yeah.
You have a follow-up question?
When you look at either platforms or development, when you talk of, say, the US-based companies' near monopoly outside of China, you also have this other factor that, for example, on Facebook or WhatsApp, there are more users in a country like India than in the US. And also in terms of developmental work in the ICT area, a substantial amount of it comes from outside the US, like, say, for example, Microsoft or Google. A lot of the development work is done in India. So, how does that sort of fit in?
Actually, this is a billion-dollar question. I think exactly those names that you mentioned, there are 7 super platforms in the world, and they basically account for 2/3 of the total market. And these are exactly those companies you mentioned: Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tencent, and Alibaba. So they basically own 2/3 of the platforms. Now, the thing about platforms is, the platforms by nature are very monopolistic. Why? Because when the platform started to get X number of people, more people will come, and that will mean more data and more value for the platform owners. And for me, as a user of the platform, I get locked in the platform. For a simple reason, if I'm in Facebook, and all my friends are in Facebook, and if you create some other book, I'm not going to go there because I'm locked in, because all my critical mass of my friends, relatives, they're all in Facebook. So this is why the platforms are naturally tend to be monopolistic. And that's exactly as you said, the Facebook, I think 90% of the developing world is using Facebook. And that's where we see 60% of the profits are created outside the US. And 90% of the taxes are paid to the US. So there is this inequality that we need to address. So to answer your question, I think it's the platforms are monopolistic. Once they have created a critical mass, it's very difficult to break the platform. Like Google, I would always go and search on Google, and then there are more people are in Google, and more search engines and more content is fed into Google, and it's an extremely valuable search engine. And it's very difficult to create another search engine. Like, for example, Google has a 90% of the search is done on Google in the world.
Yes, ma'am.
The digital economy is an economy that's evolving very quickly and is based on innovation. If I'm just thinking of like Cambridge Analytica, some governments are still trying, to pass legislation to deal with that. So how do you think government can keep up to this world and can adapt their legislation to be appropriate to this evolving world?
I think this is a very, very important point. And in fact, what we see increasingly is one government cannot do all this. So that's why we have a call for global action in our report, and looking at data ownership and data policies. We need a global actions. We need to understand at a global level. We should have a collective actions. It's the same for competition policies, the data protection. How do we protect data? How do we protect privacy on these platforms? And this is part of the the Cambridge Analytica story, that this competition policy need to be done by all. We all need to, all countries need to work on this. There needs to be some sort of an agreement, some sort of an understanding how to have competition policies. The same for taxation, same for protecting workers. So for us, as far as we can see, and there are a lot of collective actions, the countries need to work together to have effective regulations of the digital economy. This is very difficult for one country and one ad hoc action to address all these issues.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Then thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to reading your news pieces. Thank you. Thank you, Shamika.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.